Hello everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. Get ready for a very unique experience. For the very first time in our 17-year history, all of our friends and supporters can now join us for a single event that combines our Champions of Justice celebration and the Great Mississippi Road Trip. Here's our dilemma. What we want to share with you is so deep and rich that we can't fit it into a single program. So in the coming weeks, we will release extended versions on what you are about to see today with insights from my conversations with John Travis Spann of the Mississippi Civil Rights Museum. We want to thank all of those who have so generously donated to us in this challenging environment and who have enabled us to continue our mission to dismantle the culture of injustice in our state. We particularly thank our top donors for their leadership gifts. Beacons of Hope, Kazan McLean Partners Foundation, and Carolyn R. Hoffman, Jerome H. Hoffman, and Shepard A. Hoffman. Our underwriters, Bergman Draper Oslin Udu, PLLC, and Barbara and David Lipman. We are especially touched by the generous support of Shep Hoffman and his family. You know, his father, Jerome Hoffman, who is now the young age of 93, marched at Selma. So the family's commitment to our civil rights cause dates back more than half a century. Thank you. No one could have foreseen when I became MCJ's president in January 2020 just how much change this year would bring. Not the coronavirus pandemic or the united and combustible power of the modern social justice movement, and certainly not the removal of the state flag, and so much more. But what is predictable is that since 2003, MCJ has been here with our blend of litigation, advocacy, and volunteer. The board of directors and I are so very proud of our staff and their unwavering focus and fight for vulnerable Mississippians. We are honored to share highlights of their campaigns with you this evening, and we welcome your comments in social media during the program. We also welcome and we need your support. So please go to our website, mscenterforjustice.org, or use the number on your screen to text to give right now. So let's get started. The first stop on this road trip is Winona, Mississippi, where we will hear from our first honorees, the Curtis Flowers Defense Team, starting with Director of the George Riley Impact Litigation Initiative, Rob McDuff. Rob?
Thank you, Vangela, and good evening, everyone. The outlook for Curtis Flowers in 2010 was pretty grim. His unprecedented sixth trial had just ended in a guilty verdict and death sentence, and although the guilty verdicts and death sentences in the first three trials were overturned on appeal because of the prosecutor's misconduct, and the next two trials ended in mistrials, the possibility of a fourth reversal was slim. But Sherry Johnson and Keir Weibel, experienced capital defense lawyers who teach at Cornell Law School, stepped in to take the appeal, which lasted 9 years. In the middle of that appeal, another group of lawyers stepped in to reinvestigate the entire case on behalf of Curtis and be ready for the next stage, whether the appeal was won or lost. They were Tucker Carrington of the Mississippi Innocence Project and a team of lawyers from the Hogan Lovells firm, including Jonathan Abram, Katie Alley, David Maxwell, Ben Lewis, paralegal Ashley Johnson, and many others. Fortunately, the appeal was won, and in 2019, the United States Supreme Court reversed the conviction and death sentence from the sixth trial because of the prosecutor's racial discrimination in jury selection through the entire course of the trials. The case was sent back to the trial court in Winona, Mississippi for a potential seventh trial. I joined the defense of Curtis Flowers in the trial court at that point and was joined by Henderson Hill of Charlotte, North Carolina, an experienced capital defense lawyer. Working with this entire team of talented and dedicated lawyers, we assembled all of the evidence of innocence, that which had existed at the beginning and that which had been uncovered since the last trial by the defense team and by the investigative journalists from the award-winning podcast In the Dark by American Public Media. We pursued a motion for bail on behalf of Curtis, and in December, he was released after 23 years in prison. The district attorney then stepped aside in the face of our motion to recuse, and we persuaded the attorney general to dismiss the charges last month, bringing this historic and tragic case to a conclusion. In addition to the work of this defense team, MCJ also recognizes the extensive efforts of the many investigators who worked on this case and of the lawyers who represented Curtis at the prior trials and on the prior appeals, including Ray Charles Carter, Andre DeGree, Allison Steiner, Stacy Ferraro, the late Chokwe Lumumba, Harvey Freelon, Jim Craig, David Boyson, and Keith Ball, and investigator Max Mays. They faced formidable odds because of the racially stacked juries and hidden evidence by the prosecution, yet they fought for Curtis all the way through. In a moment, you will hear from my co-counsel Henderson Hill on behalf of the defense team. And then you will hear from our truly remarkable client, Curtis Flowers. But first, I want to turn it over to a friend to many of us in Mississippi and a leader in the national struggle for racial justice, the president of the National NAACP, Derrick Johnson.
Thanks, Rob. Before becoming president and CEO of the National NAACP, I served as state president for Mississippi State Conference. And I know also well how racism, be it structural or individual racism, plays out in our judicial system. The amazing journey of Curtis Flower is something that we should fight to prevent ever happening again. And as Mr. Flowers worked to rebuild his life, we should all pay special attention to the need to the continuous fight around justice, not only in our judicial system, but in society. In this moment of Black Lives Matter, a statement of fact, not a hashtag, not an organization, but a statement that clearly says that if the lives of African Americans in this country is treated with equal protection under the law, we can truly have the democracy we all strive to have. And with that in mind, I personally would like to thank my friend Rob McDuff for some of the most amazing accomplishments, but specifically for this case, but also to the entire legal team, the Mississippi Center for Justice, Vangela Wade in your leadership role, my friend Riley Morris, all the many lawyers, staff, and others who ensure that equal protection under the law is afforded to all citizens. And to Rob McDuff and the legal team for this amazing victory. Henderson Hill, Sherry, Kiera, Tucker, Hogan Lavelle, the Mississippi Innocent Project, thank you for continuing to fight for those who need the fight. So many have lost their voice, but because of the work of MCJ and many others, we can speak for those who have lost the voice to speak for themselves.
Thank you, President Derrick Johnson. On behalf of the amazing, extraordinary lawyers and advocates, the veritable dream team that Rob just named, thank you. What a gift the team was given, entrusted with the case of Curtis Flowers, an innocent man, a good man, locked in the bowels of Parchman Prison for nearly 23 years. You can't know the character and spirit of Curtis Flowers without coming to love him. And how we got to know Curtis Flowers. Mr. Flowers and his family personified the gifts of faith, hope, and love. They held tight to these gifts through decades of wrongful incarceration and prosecution. I joined the team too late to come to know Miss Lola, but I heard the stories. I could feel her presence and support in the family home and in the smiles and in the joy-infused embraces of family Flowers. The Winona jail, long a seat of white supremacy, could not crush Fannie Lou Hamer. And 50-odd years later, it failed to crush Curtis Flowers. Say her name, Breonna Taylor. I can't breathe, cried George Floyd. Well, Curtis, this crucible, your crucible, was wrong. You and your family paid an awful price, but your sacrifice and your strength and your endurance will help bend the arc. The power of your story bolsters the mighty forces that are committed to removing that heavy knee of white supremacy off the necks of Black people. Your vindication, your freedom, and the extraordinary decision by the U.S. Supreme Court in your name represents one more felled Confederate monument. Mississippi Center for Justice, we, the team, are so proud to introduce to you our brother, our friend for life, our dream client, Curtis Flowers.
I was locked up for 23 years for a crime I did not commit until I was released in December. It is a wonderful thing to be free. I had these charges hanging over my head until they were dismissed last month. It is a wonderful thing to know that I am not going back to prison. I want to thank my beautiful family and all my supporters, including many of you who are watching. And I want to thank the great team of lawyers that fought for me for many years and that eventually got me out of prison and got these charges dismissed. Sherry, Kier, Tucker, Jonathan, Katie, David, Ben, Ashley, and all the others at Hogan, Henderson, and Rob, thank you all. And to those who worked so hard to defend me in the prior trials and appeals, Ray, Allison, Andre, Stacy, Chuckway, Jim, Keith, and David. And to Max and all the other investigators who worked so hard on this case, thank you. Thank you to the Mississippi Center for Justice for helping with this case and for honoring this exceptional legal team. And thank you for letting me join you for this event. Best wishes to you all. I love you.
From Winona, we head west into the Mississippi Delta, where cotton was king and injustice a fact of life. We will hear from our champions of justice honorees, David and Barbara Littman. You know, David's life was transformed in 1964 while on the boardwalk in Atlantic City, where he witnessed Miss Fannie Lou Hamer protesting the exclusion of Black Mississippi delegates from the Democratic National Convention. David heard Ms. Hamer's searing testimony about her pursuits of voting rights and the brutal beating she received in a Winona jail. He heard her challenge to our country when she said,
I question America. Is this America, the land of the free and the home of the brave, where we have to sleep with our telephones off of the hook because our lives be threatened daily, because we want to live as decent human beings in America?
6 years later, David and Barbara Littman loaded up their 1970 orange VW and moved to Greenwood, where they worked with Ms. Hamer and others who sought to dismantle the culture of injustice around them. To introduce them is a past honoree and a longtime ally of MCJ, Professor John Britton. Professor?
Hello, my name is John Britton. David and Barbara Littman are the epitome of wife and husband team of civil rights advocates. Barbara, a former school teacher, and David, a lawyer. They were initiated into the struggle for racial justice in one of the meanest and white racist places on the US map, the Delta of Mississippi. Barbara and David Lipton, as both were coincidentally called, perhaps an unconscious confusion of their last name with the popular tea brand. That Fannie Lou Hamer, the great civil rights icon, called David, and the name a white racist superintendent referred to Barbara. This was about their only race-neutral experience for the newly married white couple in 1970, as they began their first professional job in the middle of racial segregation in the state. They have never forgotten where they started and remain steadfast in their mutual financial and moral support for the Mississippi Center for Justice. I will share just a few stories that shaped their everlasting commitment to racial justice. David began as a poverty lawyer and civil rights lawyer in North Mississippi Rural Legal Services Program in Greenwood, Mississippi. A year later, while David served as an election proctor in a voting place in Belzoni, Mississippi, a gang of white men assaulted and threatened him by shoving the barrel of a rifle down his throat and calling him a white N-word name. The assailants quickly fled, but the horrific memory etched in his mind. That night, David and Barbara dedicated their lives to civil rights and justice. Hence, the Mississippi Center for Justice awarded them the 2020 Champions of Justice Award. Barbara simultaneously launched her career in teaching in the elementary schools with a bachelor and master's degree and confronting the badges and incidences of racial and structural racism. While she interviewed with the superintendent in Greenwood, Mississippi schools, her first response by the superintendent called David for destroying the community by integrating the schools. Barbara promptly stomped out of the room. Next, the LaFleur County superintendent hired Barbara to teach at a grossly inadequate equipped school, for an example, with no air conditioning. The school was improperly located in the midst of a cotton plantation, only 25 yards from railroad tracks that noisy long trains passed by the school. And finally, the Bryant store in Money, Mississippi, where Emmett Till whistled at a white woman that led to its brutal murder, appeared directly across the street and the tracks from the school. The all-black school, which needed a white teacher to comply with school desegregation order to integrate the schools, nevertheless led Barbara to deeply adore the school children, who swarmed to her with love and affection, and she responded with kindness and compassion for them all. The newlyweds lived in communities from Greenwood, the cotton plantation capital, to Oxford, the little college town where James Meredith integrated the University of Mississippi a decade later, and last to Jackson, the capital of the state of Mississippi. Thus, the Littmans found comfort and joy as Caucasians surrounded in social circles with African Americans, and a few whites in the movement too, many of whom have maintained a half-century of friendship. I am an eyewitness to the life experiences of the Littmans in Mississippi because I too started in my first marriage in that year and first job as an attorney at the same legal organization as David, and only a year ahead of him. For more war stories about David and Barbara, I commit to equal justice and under the law, I suggest that you read Voices of Civil Rights Lawyers' Reflections from the Deep South, 1964 to 1980. Amilcar Cabral, a famous African revolutionary leader that led the people of Guinea-Bissau to independence, has said, and I quote, because it most symbolizes what David and Barbara stood for. Cabral said, "Tell no lies and claim no easy victories."
I want to thank the Mississippi Center for Justice for this honor. It means so much to me because Mississippi is such an important part of my life. I was shaped and defined by my Mississippi years. I want to congratulate our co-honorees, the Curtis Flowers Defense Team and Stanley Rip Daniels. The first time we visited Greenwood 50 years ago, I told Alex Sanders, David's future boss, and David Littman, my brand new husband, that I could never live in Greenwood. Within a month, I had moved and was living in Greenwood in the heart of the Mississippi Delta. Greenwood was a hard scrabble, frightening cotton town. I applied to teach at the Greenwood City School District. The superintendent, J.W. Dribbins, called me for an interview. And when I told him my name, he promptly told me that I would never be hired in the Greenwood system because my husband was trying to destroy the Southern way of life by integrating the segregated school system. I ended up teaching in LaFleur County schools, which was under a desegregation order. I was counted as a minority because I was Jewish. I was assigned to the Wilkes School in Money, Mississippi, directly across the street from Bryant Grocery Store, where Emmett Till had his encounter, or not, with Carolyn Bryant. Later that week, I walked into the courthouse in Greenwood to register to vote for the November 1970 midterm election. There I met Christine Chandler, the supervisor of elections. I introduced myself. Our meeting was short. As soon as I told her my last name was Lippman, she spit all over my face. At the end of the week, I went to Dr. Alford's office on River Road in Greenwood to see about my sore throat. Given the choice to sit in the white waiting room or the black waiting room as the signs indicated, I sat down in the black waiting room. It was a long day. Dr. Alford took all the patients from the white waiting room, and then he saw all the patients in the black waiting room. Hours later, he saw me. Not a word was spoken about my day-long wait. That was my first week in Greenwood. Teaching at the Money School was one of the most enriching experiences of my life. I was the first white female teacher since Reconstruction. All of my students were children of sharecroppers who worked the fields of the cotton plantations in Money. The 2 mills at the school were the reason most students attended. The unair-conditioned school was in the middle of a cotton field. My first graders had never seen a pencil or scissors. Their one school outfit smelled of pesticides from the cotton. They had never spoken to a white woman. They called me Miss Lipton. These sharecropper children were from large families and had never been to Greenwood, which was only 12 miles away. They were tired because they chopped cotton. They were hungry. They missed months of school in the fall chopping cotton and in the spring when cotton was planted. Their school year was only about 5 months. As you know, MCJ has an event annually in October. It is our Champions of Justice dinner. The following day, we all board a bus and spend several days touring the Delta. We stop in places where important civil rights activities occurred. One of my favorite destinations is our visit to the Little Zion Church on the Money Road, near the Bryant Grocery Store in the school where I taught. When I walk in the door, I am home. My former student, Sylvester Hoover, is the deacon. Mary Hoover, Sylvester's wife, who was also one of my students, greets me with a strong embrace. They are in their 50s, and of course they remember me since I am Miss Lipton, their only white teacher. I'm very proud of both of them, and I am really proud of our Mississippi Center for Justice.
I'm honored by the Mississippi Center of Justice as a co-championship of justice this year. But I think you have it backwards. It's Barbara and I that should be honoring MCJ for its work on the front lines fighting racism and injustice in Mississippi. And congratulations to our other co-champions of justice, my Barbara, Rip Daniels, the entire Curtis Flowers defense team. And on behalf of the MCJ family, Mr. Curtis Flowers, we rejoice in your freedom. MCJ is a direct legal descendant of the civil rights movement. And I've always felt that it is our clients, the heroes of the civil rights movement, who have so inspired with their courage, with their strength, with their grace, and with their conviction. I want to share an experience that captures these qualities of our clients, that's uplifting and inspiring. It's Sunflower County in the heart of the Delta, and it was 1971. I was a 25-year-old lawyer, and I was prosecuting a major civil rights case on behalf of the black community of the town of Sunflower. The railroad tracks divided the community. On the black side of town in the residential area, none of the streets were paved. There were no there were no sewer systems. There were no street lights or fire hydrants. Of course, on the white residential side of town, they had all of those services. We brought suit, a class action. Mrs. Leela Mae Burkes, a strong client, was the named plaintiff in that case, and she led the charge. Trial was set in Greenville, about 45 minutes from the town of Sunflower. Incidentally, Martha Bergmark, Barbara, and myself worked with me that summer on the case. She was a first-year lawsuit. So trial was set in the case before a formidable federal judge, William C. Cady. I arrived in Sunflower to ride with my clients on a school bus from church. They were all dressed in their Sunday best. They sang civil rights songs. Mrs. Burkes led the way. We arrived in Greenville at court, and as we got off the bus to enter the courthouse, a big gauntlet of white folks were throwing flour and tomatoes and mud at us, all over us. We walked into court with filth all over us, sat in a segregated courtroom. I sat at counsel table with my clients, and rows of my clients sat behind us. And on the other side were the white folks with their white counsel. A couple minutes later, the marshal handed me a white towel. I handed it to Mrs. Burkes, who was sitting next to me, and she handed it to Mrs. Fannie Lou Hamer, who helped organize our client group. Mrs. Hamer took that white towel and walked down the row of clients and handed it in the last row. She came back and sat down with us at the table. A few minutes expired, and the marshal came back, left the courtroom, and came back with a wicker basket full of towels, dozens of white towels. I handed them to Mrs. Hamer, and she distributed them to the clients. Judge Cady walked into the courtroom, we announced that we were ready, asked me to make our opening statement. And as I started walking over to the lectern, I bent down to Mrs. Hamer and I whispered to her, asked Mrs. Hamer, told her, "You know, you never hate." She looked at me right in my eyes and she said, "Lawyer Lipton, that hate will just poison your mind. It'll ruin your soul." We won the trial. Judge Cady, as he often did, announced later that day after the trial in a bench ruling right from the court. And as we were gathering our papers, Judge Cady's law clerk asked me if I could introduce Mrs. Hamer and Mrs. Burkes to him. As I introduced Mrs. Hamer and Mrs. Burkes to Judge Cady, I looked over and I was just struck by Mrs. Hamer and Mrs. Burkes' regal beauty, their strength and their resolve. And I'll never forget that. They looked like heads of state. No hate, regal, strong, and committed. I accept this honor, and I thank each of my clients over the years from Mississippi and elsewhere who have taught me and who have enriched my life. And now MCJ and its work, you inspire a new generation, you lawyers and activists who will make this state of Mississippi and nation more just. Thank you.
David's first case for Ms. Hamer was to get a justice court judge to return her friend's repossessed sofa. David got this done, and Ms. Hamer was persuaded that she could trust him with bigger fights. For most low-income Mississippians, justice court is a gateway into our legal system. It can be intimidating and confusing to those who don't understand how to defend themselves. To level the odds for debtors in justice court, MCJ launched the Navigator program in Jackson, and now we are poised to take it to the Mississippi Delta. Here to explain is Advocacy Director Beth Orlansky. Beth.
After years of being frustrated with the way unrepresented litigants are treated in debt collection and eviction cases, MCJ's Consumer Protection Division was able to create a Justice Court Navigator project to assist people brought into Justice Court. The project was developed by a Harvard Public Interest Law Fellow, assisted by longtime MCJ supporter Luther Ott, who gave us both pro bono and financial assistance to make the project successful. As of last January, Sierra Williams has taken over the Justice Court Navigator project in Hinds County.
We have volunteer navigators from Jackson area colleges and law schools ready to offer assistance to justice court litigants in Hinds County. COVID-19 has moved all justice court proceedings online for the time being. However, we have been observing cases online, and we have prepared how-to instructions for litigants to participate virtually. Through outreach to community groups, our goal is to drastically reduce the number of default judgments entered in Hinds County Justice Court.
So the Justice Court Navigator program, initially implemented in the Hinds County Justice Court system a few years ago, will have a significant impact on communities in the Mississippi Delta, specifically when you take into consideration that in many of these communities, the annual income of people is around $17,000 a year, or sometimes lower. Now, take that, and that's about $1,400 per month for a person. The Justice Court Navigator program is implemented in the justice court system. Consumer debt cases. People can get hauled into court by companies and have up to 25% of their wages garnished. So about $1,400 a month after a 25% wage garnishment. That leaves a family with about $900 a month to live off of. That is devastating in some of these communities, especially when you take into consideration that you have single parent households, people who are living below the poverty level. And likewise, in landlord and tenant cases, which are also conducted in justice court, simply having a lawyer or understanding your rights increases your chances of winning your case. Community members in these towns, these counties, oftentimes can't afford a lawyer, while companies that haul them into courts or landlords oftentimes are represented by legal representation when they go into court. So simply having a lawyer, understanding your rights, increases your chances of staying in your home and also holding on to the well-deserved, much-needed money families need to live off of each month.
5 years ago, while on my second MCJ road trip, my eyes were opened to the extraordinary civil rights history that unfolded in Hattiesburg and on the Gulf Coast. It's my honor to share some of these stories, as well as examples of housing work for which our Biloxi office is so famous. Let's begin with a visit to the historic area known as the Kelly Settlement, just outside of Hattiesburg, with members of the family of voting rights martyr Vernon Dana.
So Hattiesburg has always been a little bit more progressive area, and you had individuals who were willing to step out front. But my dad, he had come out of that family of this belief of working to create a better society. So yes, this farm and the other businesses gave him somewhat of an economic cushion. So farming, cattle, lumber were his main three businesses that my dad operated. The country store was another one that he got into, basically to just provide a place where black people could go and shop and be treated with respect and dignity. But that independence allowed him to provide jobs for people in this community, to work, to have an income. It also gave him the opportunity to be vocal publicly about his advocacy for civil rights. The way my dad looked at things was, hey, if you're working, you're paying taxes, you deserve the same rights and privileges as anybody else. Because my dad took a public stance of everybody should have the right to vote. That created a lot of friction between him and the white community. You know, he worked in the community. They built movements all over this state, okay? And out of those movements, a lot was accomplished. Gaining the voting right was one of them. Integration, another one, okay? Access to better education, another one. And that advocacy is what eventually cost him his life.
Vernon Damon was interested in trying to keep the land in the family. And it's important to keep it in the family. Well, you know, they don't make any more land. And we need to keep all we can get. In fact, we need to buy more if we can get it.
2 years ago, the MCJ Housing Campaign designed a project to promote community redevelopment of blighted and neglected communities throughout the state of Mississippi. This project provides free supportive legal services to nonprofits across the state that are engaged in blight elimination and redevelopment in their communities. And this year, we are very excited to be working with a new partner, Twin Forks Rising, here in Hattiesburg. The founder of Twin Forks Rising, Deborah Delgado, joins us to describe her organization's work in this Hattiesburg neighborhood.
Thank you. Twin Forks Rising was founded to address the needs of low and moderate income communities that have been neglected by the city of Hattiesburg throughout its history. We are a nonprofit working to renovate existing properties and build new homes, including the one we are sitting in front of now. This property belongs to Mr. James Hendricks, a disabled veteran. We are excited to be working in partnership with the Mississippi Center for Justice. The supportive legal services that Mississippi Center for Justice provides to Twin Forks Rising at no cost make it possible for us to ensure that Mr. Hendricks and dozens of other residents will have well-maintained, affordable housing that they can live in and pass on to others for their future use.
My name is Dolores Robinson. With the help of the Mississippi Center for Justice, I was able to stand up to my landlord and legally own my home that I worked so hard to buy. My husband and I signed the contract on the home in 2004, and sadly he passed away in 2018. But I know he's looking down and is proud that we finally made it through.
Over 50 years following its enactment in 1968, the Federal Fair Housing Act is under attack, and those who discriminate continue to behave as if there are no consequences for their actions. Now the MCJ Housing Law Campaign is staffing a Fair Housing Act project across 30 Mississippi counties to protect Mississippians from unlawful housing discrimination. I'm here with Mrs. Dolores Robertson, who was victimized by discrimination in furtherance of a rent-to-own fraud scheme. Mrs. Robertson had been paying on a lease purchase agreement since before Hurricane Katrina and had paid well beyond the agreed-upon purchase price, but her landlord refused to deed her the home. Instead, the landlord, who targets African Americans and Latinos for this fraud, filed an eviction action against her. The Center for Justice came to Mrs. Robertson's defense, filed counterclaims against her landlord, and once the evidence was presented, the court awarded the property to Mrs. Robertson. The center also defended Ms. Robertson against the landlord's appeal. She now owns her own home and can live free from fear of further unlawful discrimination.
Good afternoon. I'm John Jopling, the director of the Mississippi Center for Justice Housing Law Campaign. I'm so proud and inspired to work with terrific young lawyers like Kiara and Will. This year, in addition to the Community Redevelopment Initiative and the Fair Housing Act Enforcement Project, the Housing Law Campaign has stretched its staff power and resources to respond to an unexpected crisis, the rising tidal wave of evictions surging higher and higher as more and more Mississippians lose their income due to coronavirus-related layoffs, furloughs, and terminations. According to estimates, the number of households facing eviction in Mississippi could reach 150,000 by January 1st. In April, we mobilized to go after landlords who were constructively evicting people in violation of our state moratorium. And we established a hotline to provide much-needed information and counsel to those faced with eviction or threats of eviction. To date, our hotline has serviced over 190 clients. We have helped 90 individuals qualify for rental assistance programs that only became operational in July. And since September 4th, when the Center for Disease Control moratorium went into effect, we have helped 68 individuals complete the declaration in order to obtain the protections of the moratorium. The Center for Justice can meet this challenge, but only with the continued help of our supporters and donors. Thank you, and thank you for stopping by.
Thanks, John. Now our final stop on this virtual tour is on the Gulf Coast, where we will meet our final honoree, Stanley Rip Daniels. And we could have no better tour guide than former Biloxi Mayor and former MCJ board member, Gerald Blessey. Gerald?
As the Gulf Coast comes into view, we will see its 26-mile-long public beach, bounded by a highway that's lined with centuries-old live oaks. 150 years ago, most whites in this area lived on or near the Mississippi Sound. When the Civil War ended, two families of emancipated slaves used their freedom to found their own settlement, well away from the shore on swampland along Turkey Creek, where their descendants 6 generations later still live. Historically, whites here have thought of themselves as culturally different from the rest of the state, but make no mistake, racial injustice was and is present here. Prior to Hurricane Katrina, the Confederate battle flag was still flying on a display on the public beach. Then our third honoree, Rip Daniels, decided to do something about that. And what Rip started, Katrina finished, as you will learn. And finally, the Mississippi legislature this year removed the Confederate battle flag from the official state flag. In 1959, my dear friend, Dr. Gilbert Mason, took his son, Gilbert Jr., down to the Biloxi Beach near the lighthouse to swim together in the waters of the Mississippi Sound. He was arrested for violating the Jim Crow ban on blacks using the public beach. Over the course of the next few years, Dr. Mason and his colleague, Dr. Felix Dunn of Gulfport, led a series of protest wait-ins in Biloxi and Gulfport, attended by hundreds of black men, women, and children, including Dr. Mason's Boy Scout troop. After a white mob descended upon the Biloxi protesters on Bloody Sunday, April 24th, 1960, the Department of Justice sued Harrison County for discrimination. And a month later, Medgar Evers and Dr. Mason formed the Biloxi chapter of the NAACP to organize and lead further action. The Department of Justice case proceeded slowly, and frustrated with that pace at Medgar Evers' suggestion, Dr. Mason led another final wait-in and was arrested again along with 71 others, and calling, therefore, some fresh attention in the national media to the slow pace of the Department of Justice case. In 1967, the protesters finally won their case in federal court, right here in the district court in Mississippi. Here to share some reflections on this period is Dr. Gilbert Mason, Jr., who accompanied his father on the original wait-ins. Dr. Mason.
Biloxi Beach wait-ins were among the first nonviolent demonstrations to take place in the state of Mississippi. Heard that my father was a champion swimmer. We moved to Biloxi. It really hurt him deeply that he could not enjoy basically a swimming pool in his front yard. When I was 5 in 1959, Dad's day off from his office was Thursday, and he had been talking about going down to the beach. Dad saw one of our neighbors and rolled down the window and said, "Murray, do you feel like getting in trouble today or this weekend?" And Murray said, "Well, sure, Doc, but there's some things I need to wrap up first. So I'm going to go home, and you let me know when it's time to go." And Dad gathered up some other neighbors, and so they all piled me in a car, and the others came in their cars, and went down to the beach. And while they were down there, were spotted by a motorcycle cop who'd come to investigate an auto accident on Highway 90, and saw them on the beach and came out and challenged them about being there, telling them they shouldn't be there. So eventually, he and Mrs. Soche went down to the station. They while I was taken away with the other neighbors back home, and over the next day or so, Dad encountered the mayor, Laz Quaid, and Mr. Quaid looked him in the eye and said, "If you go back down there, we're going to leave you down there." And that's the last thing you want to say to Dr. Mason. Senior.
To introduce our third honoree, Rip Daniels, is his longtime friend, attorney Felicia Dunn Burkes, whose father, Dr. Felix Dunn, joined forces with Dr. Gilbert Mason Sr. to desegregate the public Gulf Coast beaches. Thank you, Felicia.
I've known Rip, Gilbert Mason has known Rip since we were children. We were all in the same kindergarten together in Biloxi, Miss Green's kindergarten. And let me tell you, from the beginning, Rip, as a 4- and 5-year-old, had a passion for defending those who were a little shy, a little timid, a little less fortunate than others. He was always the one that would stand up for anyone in our class or in our school who maybe was being picked on or mistreated. He was always a defender of the weak and the helpless. Now, he's continued that throughout his life. You know, he started off as a radio personality, but even working for someone else, Rip was very passionate about bringing issues of importance to the community that the radio station served. And it lit in him a fire to continue that advocacy, that ability to share and give information to his community, such that it drove him to own his own radio station. And thus we come to the adult Stanley Rip Daniels, owner of WJZD Inc. and owner and CEO of the American Blues Network. Ladies and gentlemen, through this platform, Rip has been a drum major for justice throughout the state of Mississippi. With WJZD, he has brought Tom Joyner, national radio personality, who is very active on a national basis in terms of advocacy on health and education and voter registration, on a myriad of issues that impact the African American community and poor and underserved communities at large. Rip's show, It's a New Day, is a constant feed of information that his listeners can rely on to get information that is important in their lives, their children's lives, their parents' lives, so that they can make very well-informed decisions about how they want their community to go forward. So again, thank you to the Mississippi Center for Justice for this very well-deserved honor from my dear, dear lifelong friend, Stanley Whip Daniels. Thank you.
Thank you, Felicia, my dearest, dearest friend. Couldn't think of anyone else that could introduce me except you. I really enjoy your heaping praise on me. Of course, that was the first time, I can tell you that. I don't know how much they paid you, but I want you to know I really appreciate it. I appreciate that as much as I appreciate this honor. For the Mississippi Center for Justice to even think that I was worthy of such an honor speaks to my heart. I've always appreciated the Mississippi Center for Justice for its efforts. Always thought there was somewhere, there's this agency just in case I got into really too much trouble. I had somebody to call. And so now here I am, being honored by them as one of the champions of justice. So my thanks, and an extraordinary thanks to the team that's worked with me. And you guys, I know I probably surprised you. You didn't think that I thought you were a friend. I most certainly do. And I am just delighted to know that you consider me as a friend. And at times like this, when every sense of integrity and dignity is questioned, it harkens back to a time when men like me and looked like me and my father and many others had to literally prove themselves to people who really weren't worthy, but prove themselves they did by their quest for justice. There were very few organizations then. But I was so lucky to grow up in the bastion of giants who had a complete and utter disregard for their own lives. The thought that I rode my bicycle down Nixon Street almost right into the blown up office of Dr. Gilbert R. Mason. Or to think that I went to McDaniel's funeral home and took my little finger at 6 years old and stuck it in a bullet hole. Or to think that that infamous day when the second weigh-in happened, I would hear my mother and father argue about whether he should or should not go. Actually, it was one-sided because my mother was insistent that he did not, and my father said absolutely nothing besides put on those big heavy boots that he wore for cement finishing and proceed out the door. His last words was, "I'm going, Amonette, and that's it. I'm part of this fabric, and I'm going to be here." That combined with the fact that my father had shared the story of his great-great-grandfather who was at Vicksburg, who slit his master's throat and joined Union forces and killed every Confederate he could put his hands on, that combined with the fact that I was a pretty rambunctious guy, and in the first integrating class in the 8th grade at East Junior High, that forced me to not just accept the status quo. The Confederacy was not synonymous with the South, in my view. My great-great-grandparents were the South. My relatives were Southerners, but they weren't Confederate. Which is why I had a bone to pick whenever I saw the Confederate flag or whenever there were those who sought to represent me. Which brought me to the 8 Flags display as a very young 20-something-year-old spry guy. Actually, I may have been a little older. I had written a letter to the owner, the manager of Edgewater Mall, because they were flying the Confederate battle flag, and they had been flying the Bonnie Blue flag, the Mississippi Magnolia. And for whatever reason, they changed it. And for me, that was a battle flag, and it is a battle flag. And so subsequently, I wrote a letter to her. She took it down. She contacted Beauvoir, and that started the whole quest then. First in front of Edgewater Mall, and then at the 8 Flags display. I went on, wrote many letters to the editors, complained, appeared before the Board of Supervisors and so forth. So one fine day after having my radio station in 1995, I decided today was the day that I was just simply going to correct this situation. You see, it was a Confederate battle flag, but that was not the flag that was flown there. The Confederate battle flag went up in 1968 when the federal courts ruled that African Americans could go on the beach. It did not represent my love for the coast. It was antithetical to what a United States was and what this place meant to me. So, one fine day, 1995, I decided to go down and lower the Confederate flag, but hoist the original Confederate flag. What I mean by that, the stars and bars were the circle of stars and the 3 bars. I bought that at Bedwell, believe it or not. And so when I took down the Confederate battle flag, I hoisted the historically accurate Confederate flag. Of course, that took some doing for me to even hoist it, but I did. But just to demonstrate that it was not about being historically accurate, it was more about the commentary of the rebel flag. And that started it. That was my way of getting the information out. Now there was a desire to figure out what was wrong, why it's wrong, and as well as that, to establish that I'm a part of the Mississippi Gulf Coast. I'm a part of the coast, and more than anything else, I'm not going to let anybody run me off. So, 20 some odd years thereafter, maybe a little longer, Mississippi now is rid of the state banner that has the Confederate battle flag in the canton. Victorious. You see, that's a prime example of how justice may not be immediate, but as someone very wiser than I said, ultimately you will get there, which is why this honor is so important to me. If there is no one fighting for what is just, and notice I didn't say what is right, I didn't say what was fair, I said what is just, then trust me on this, then there will be no such thing as that statue of justice. If you have no justice, then needless to say you don't have anything to back up what you think is right, what you think is wrong, or even what you think is fair. So I'm delighted to be one of the honorees, and even more delighted that my family chose here to live. I'm a very proud Mississippian, and I'm prouder yet and have the greatest resolve for making sure that this state does what is just by all.
Good evening. My name is Walter Boone, and I am the chairman of the board of directors of the Mississippi Center for Justice. It is my honor and privilege to give our thanks and appreciation. First, to our champions of justice and honorees. Our own Barbara and David Lippman to start. Barbara and David, friends, civil rights veterans, civil rights activists, MCJ bedrock contributors and supporters. You came first to Mississippi in 1970 and gave us a piece of your youth in the fight for justice. And you came back later in 2003 to give MCJ a bedrock contributing force. For all that you've done for those we serve, for the state of Mississippi, and for the Mississippi Center for Justice, we thank both of you. Stanley Rip Daniels, sir, thank you for your voice, your leadership, your activism, and your efforts to preserve the Turkey Creek neighborhood. This is not just a relic of slavery. This is American history. This is Mississippi history. This is our history. Thank you for what you've done to preserve it. To the Curtis Flowers defense team and all of those that have helped gain his freedom over the last 23 years. When Mr. Flowers was released on bail, he told the media that he always knew the day would come, but he just didn't know when. While Mr. Flowers was expressing a great deal of confidence in our criminal justice system, which quite frankly had failed him for the previous 23 years, he was expressing more confidence in you. That confidence was well placed. Thank you for what you did for him and what you've done as a result for all of us. To our donors, your generous contributions in this time of dire need are humbling. Because of you, we surpassed our original goal of fundraising for this event, and in fact, we broke the record for fundraising for this event over the history of MCJ. But we are very aware that that great success is an ironic combination of, number one, your continuing goodwill, but number two, the great challenge before us. To our board of directors, you continue to inspire us and inspire me. When we ask, you give your time, your money, and your invaluable insight and experience. To Vangela and the entire MCJ staff, never has so much been owed by so many to so few. When I hear those words, I think about you and the work that you are doing. You are making a difference in this challenging time. Thank you. 2020, a year like no other. Someday our kids and grandkids are going to look at us and they're going to ask us, what did you do in 2020 to confront injustice, to help those in need, to give voice to those who have not been heard? We want you to be able to say, I stood with the Mississippi Center for Justice. I went to their website, mscenterforjustice.org. I followed them on social media. I volunteered and got involved. I gave money. I stood for justice. Now is the time. We need your help. Thank you for all you've done, and thank you for what you will do in this time.
This year, Mississippi finally removed the racist Confederate emblem from its state flag. At the head of momentum for change this year was a historic wave of statewide multiracial protests against systemic racism and the police killing of African American citizens George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, and Breonna Taylor. Young Mississippians led the charge, leaving no doubt that Black Lives Matter. And MCJ was proud to support these protests with training and legal observers to ensure people's rights were protected. Before long, this summer's movement will be added to the walls of the Mississippi Civil Rights Museum, and the momentum will continue. No matter the era, no matter the challenge, MCJ has been and will be at the forefront of the fight to end social injustice in Mississippi. The situations are unusual, and the work, it takes time, and it takes resources, but the results are still extraordinary. At the Mississippi Center for Justice, we attack the laws and the policies that systematically keep Mississippi at the bottom of every national measure of human and societal well-being. We are committed to ensuring racial and economic justice for every Mississippian. It is in our national interest, and it is our moral imperative that this legacy be eradicated. With your continued support and your continued partnership, we can do just that. So please, go to our website now, mscenterforjustice.org, and donate to fund the change that you want to see in Mississippi. Thank you again to Shep and Jerome Hoffman and their family, and all of our generous sponsors, friends, and supporters. To each of you for watching, for joining us for our Champions of Justice Great Mississippi Road Trip. Thank you, and have a good evening.
Put some doubt in if we want to change this thing. So guess what? We've got some praying to do. Listen, oh, guess I'm talking to you. This is the same thing that we said before. I can't breathe. Oh, I can't breathe. Stand if you're with me. If you're with me, stand. Stand if you're with me. If you're with me, stand. Politicians and pastors preaching, mothers and teachers seeking justice and solace at the same time, singing and praising, driving each other crazy. That's why the truth is so hazy. Stand with me, guess what? We've got some praying to do. Listen, oh, guess I'm talking to you. This is the same thing that we said before. It's our time, it's our time, it's our time. Stand if you're with me. If you're with me, stand. 'Cause I keep singing, 'cause that's what I gotta do. If it means I'll get through to you, because I gotta put some doubt in your mind. It's the sign of the times. I put thousands of miles on my feet. I keep running from and running to justice. We can all change the world if we just change our hearts and our minds. So, yeah, Mississippi, get your folk in the Bible Belt, the East Coast, the West Coast, the folks up north, Washington, D.C., and overseas, please stand. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.